Yingwu on the west bank of the Chuzhou Gorge. I love the shaded grass that grows beside the gorge. Above it, yellow orioles chirp deep in the woods. The spring flood, swelled by rain, flows faster at evening. At this deserted ferry, one must get the boat across alone. So we continue with Wei Jingwu, whom, as you've known, because we've encountered him quite a few times in the past, is a high Tang, early mid Tang poet. He served under Emperor Xuanzong and in a series of provincial postings. In fact, this poem of his was probably written because of the reference to Chuzhou in the year 784, because between 784 and 785, Wei Jingwu was posted in the province of Chuzhou as governor. Now, this is the 12th and last poem by Wei Jingwu in this anthology, and it's a quatrain, a heptasyllabic quatrain. Most of his poems were in the old style, if you will remember. That seems to be the genre that is particularly associated with Wei Jingwu. Regardless of that, I think this poem is probably one of his most famous. I'm pretty sure I've encountered it before somewhere, and it's generally praised and subjected in the traditional Chinese literary criticism, even today, to a high degree of praise. Part of that praise deals with the allegorical interpretation of the poem, but we will talk about that in a minute. So, on the west bank of the Chuzhou Gorge, on the face of it, it's just a typical landscape poem. Yeah, basically, you have this poetic persona, who is in this west bank of a river, Chuzhou Gorge, and he describes what he sees, basically some shaded grass that grows next to the gorge. There's some birds singing high in the woods. The water of the river is flowing pretty high because it's spring, it has rained, so you have the season. So the waters are quite high and flowing faster than ever. And the poetic persona is in a ferry. He wants to cross, but there's nobody there. So he has to ferry himself from one side of the river to the other one. So on the face of it, it's a pretty straightforward landscape poem depicting a slightly sad, slightly melancholy spring scene in which the poet is alone amidst some lovely vegetation and some waters that are probably a little bit dangerous. But as we've mentioned a lot of times, there are many levels of interpretation, and many of these levels were understood by the Chinese writers of this time and by the critics of this and later times as complementary and necessary for understanding the deeper meaning of the poem, or other possible meanings of the poem. We've mentioned, I think, that a lot of Chinese poetry that seems to be describing the landscape is also describing feelings, and this was especially successfully achieved in Tang poetry. This apparently objective nature scenes where the elements of nature are indirectly reflecting, transmitting the feelings of the poet. Also, a success of high Tang poetry is generally the inclusion of reverberations, of echoes, of something beyond the words that allows the readers to, really appropriate the poem and use the ambiguity or the suggestiveness of the original poems, which, as we say, tend to hide sometimes explicit statement of feelings, so as to allow the reader to make the poem his and push forward into it whatever feelings or emotions he or she feels when reading the poem. But here we have another aspect. So there is this tradition that we've talked about, especially of the scholar officials, of believing, according to a famous sentence, I think, in the Book of Documents, that poetry expresses what's in the mind intently. And this view of the Confucians about what literature should be was developed in the Warring States period and in the early Han Dynasty, and was specifically applied to a certain type of text, the classic of odes, the Shi Jing. So these were poems of quite a high antiquity already by the Han Dynasty, some of the earliest having been composed probably at least 500, 600, 700 years before the Han Dynasty. Some others probably not so old, maybe 300, 200. Now these poems, especially the heirs of the states, are poems that just, they're simple, the typical simple folksy poetry that you find in all of the literary traditions of the world. Simple love poems, descriptive love poems of nature, poems about feelings and so on. But the Confucian philosophical tradition reappropriated these poems for itself and lent them moral meanings, because Confucian philosophy is basically about the importance of morality and correct moral behavior. So the Confucian tradition latched on these poems meanings of praise and criticism, of political praise and criticism of rulers. So the poems of the Book of Odes were interpreted by this tradition, which is mostly codified in a Han work, which is the Mao commentary to the Book of Odes. They codified those poems through their hidden meanings. Like this poem might be about a woman who was seduced and abandoned by a man, but really what it's talking about is about Duke such and such who didn't treat the people properly, and the abandoned woman is a symbol for the people who are complaining and suffering under a bad ruler. So it's this sort of thing, and a lot of these allegorical interpretations are very far-fetched. But regardless of this reading strategy became the norm during the Han Dynasty. And it would continue with scholar officials later on, and it would be extended not only to the poems of the Book of Odes, but to any production of a scholar official. The scholar officials wrote poetry not just with an aesthetical intention in mind. They really assumed that poetry expresses intentions. Some of these expressions might be purely subjective, but a lot of them were expected to be political criticism, which was relatively permitted as long as it was hidden in poetry, so it was not too blunt or too obvious or too direct a criticism of the sovereign. So this allegoresis was employed whether the original poets had the intention of using it or not by critics and later scholars for almost all types of Chinese poetry. And this has happened to this poem. So as I said before, this poem on the face of it seems to be just a poem describing nature. But many scholars, I think from the Song Dynasty onwards, interpret it as criticism of the times in which Wei Jingwu was living, that is after the Anushan rebellion and in the consequent chaos that was brought about by it. So if you accept this interpretation, then the shaded grass that grows by the side of the gorge represents the gentleman in the wilderness, because the scholar official gentleman is plain, simple, unassuming and unambitious, like the grass in the shade. It's in the shade of imperial favor. And he also has simple tastes. So like the scholar official, like the grass, finds his enjoyment in simple things. The yellow orioles calling in the deep woods would be the villains in office, whose cunning words are like the river's rapid current. The water in the gorge naturally flows fast, but is swollen by spring rains. And, this could be a symbol of the difficulties, the dangers of the times, the rebellions, the wars. The fact that the waters of the river are swollen can act as a metaphor for the fact that the problems of the nation have increased. The flow becomes more urgent at evening, so there is danger for the nation, confusion among those at court, as their season in power is drawing to an end. In the same way, the evening sun is growing dim and will not brighten again before it sets. So the poem says, at this deserted ferry, one must get the boat across alone, which would symbolize that, the poetic persona, the good, virtuous scholar official who is in exile in this provincial backwater, has yet talent enough to help the world cross the figurative river at this moment of hesitation. So just as this scholar official, the virtuous scholar official in provinces, is the virtuous guy who's, really able to govern the country and steer it through the dangers, just like so he is able to steer a small barge across this river in this provincial area, which would make him an unusually good candidate for a minister. And a wise ruler reading this should make use of him. So I ignore if Wei Jingwu really did have this intention in writing this poem, and you can overlap this interpretation on it. On the other side, it might just be a description of a solitary outing of Wei Jingwu in nature, and the sad melancholy loneliness that he experiences in a relatively abandoned landscape. Okay, let's go as usual, couplet by couplet, a bit quickly because we've spent a lot of time talking about allegories and the symbolic or allegorical meaning that this poem might have. First couplet. I love the shaded grass that grows beside the gorge. Above it, yellow orioles chirp deep in the woods. So the first couplet usually sets the scene. We know from the title that we are on the west bank of the Chuzhou Gorge, and that western bank gets described by two elements, which in a very common method in Chinese poetry are a visual one and an oral one. So in the first line, we have shaded grass, which grows next to the gorge. Grass has a lot of symbolism in traditional Chinese poetry. It represents parting, long parting. It represents the eternal greenness of the spring. It represents simplicity, and in the allegorical interpretation which we've seen, this simplicity could be equated to the simple, unassuming, humble scholar official who is not in positions of power. And clearly the author, the poetic persona of the poem, loves simplicity. He very explicitly states the poem by saying how much he loves this shaded grass. It's in the shade, not in the light, not in the limelight, whether it be the sun's light or the emperor's light. So there's this grass growing next to the shore. It's humble, but it's beloved by Wei Jingwu, or his poetic persona. And not quite there, but above it, in some other place above, and again above, we said it can be interpreted as, literally above, or maybe above, like in the court, in the world of power. Above, yellow orioles chirp deep in the woods. So you can see the hearing of birds. They're spring birds, the orioles. So this already sets the setting as spring. And again, this might be just a pleasant impression, pleasant musical background to the poetic persona's enjoyment of the scene. Again, it might have overtones that these chirpers, these loud-mouthed birds, might be a symbol for something not so nice. Maybe those that are high in the sky and in the court and who reap the emperor's favor. The second couplet, as usual, there is a change generally in the third line of a quatrain, like a change of focus. Like the first couplet was purely descriptive. The second couplet continues telling us the story, but centers more the poem in an action, in a dangerous action that is going, or relatively dangerous action, that is going to take place now. The spring flood, swelled by rain, flows faster at evening. At this deserted ferry, one must get the boat across alone. So the focus now goes back to the water of Chuzhou Gorge, not to the surrounding landscape elements, whether grass or birds. Now the river itself is depicted as swelled by rain. Now, because this is spring, and in spring in China, presumably it rains a lot, or the ice caps from where the river that might be here, the Huai or maybe the Yangtze, have melted and have increased the surge of the river. So the river is swelling and it's going fast, especially at evening. So not only do we have the season, it's the end of the day, which already brings in this bittersweet melancholy that the end of the day always has or generally has in Chinese poetry. So this also paints a scene of relative danger. So if the poet wants to cross, which we know from the last line, so the waters are not calm and subdued and still. No, they are swelled by the rain and flowing faster. So they have their danger. And again, as symbols of danger, they might be representing something else, like the chaos or the dangers of the rebellions in the country. And finally, at this deserted ferry, one must get the boat across alone. The poet is alone, and this emphasizes the sadness and the melancholy of the scene. The ferry is deserted. One must, if one wants to get across, do it by himself, exposing oneself to the dangers. He or she will probably be able to do it. There's no indication that, even though it might be difficult, it's not possible. And again, this sad image, it's a picturesque scene. You can imagine, you can very easily paint the poetic persona in the bank of a river looking at swelling waters, no human to be seen all around. So it ends in this sad, melancholy, very visual image, which again, as we said, might be interpreted with the overtones of the deserted ferry in this deserted area, as a symbol for the whole province in which Wei Jingwu might be languishing as a great scholar official in a provincial backwater. And at the same time, his ability to cross might be a symbol of other abilities that he has, maybe for government or for strategy. So, quite a simple on the face of it, but quite an interesting poem.